So what if the very things you're doing right now to grow, like the relentless reading, the habit tracking?
The optimized morning routines?
Yeah, exactly. The endless pursuit of self-improvement. What if all of that spiritual and personal hustle is actually the exact thing keeping you completely disconnected from reality?
It's a terrifying thought, honestly.
It really is. Today, we're looking at a perspective that claims your obsession with progress might just be, well, arrogance in disguise. So, welcome to this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. And if you're listening to this, you're probably someone who is deeply curious. You want profound insights, but you are frankly exhausted by the constant barrage of information telling you to just do more, be more, optimize every waking second of your life.
Which is, that's everyone right now. Right?
Oh, 100%. So we're promising you a journey today that is going to challenge your most fundamental views on productivity, on rest, and on what it actually means to grow.
It's going to be a really fascinating exploration, largely because we're looking at a text that takes our hyper-modern anxieties about, performance and burnout, and it mirrors them in this profoundly ancient story.
Right. So the mission for today's deep dive is to unpack this highly psychological, intensely mystical commentary on the Book of Exodus. Specifically, we're looking at the events early in the story when Moses first confronts the Egyptian empire.
Yeah, chapters 5 and 6.
Exactly. And the text is called The Path of Inward Suffering, written by Madame Guyon. Now, just to set the stage here, we really need a little context because we are not looking at Exodus as just a historical event today.
No, not at all.
We aren't talking about archaeological digs or chariots or the literal parting of the Red Sea.
Right, because we have to understand who Madame Guyon was to understand what she's doing with this text.
Right.
So she was a 17th century French mystic, and her approach to scripture is entirely allegorical. It's totally psychological.
So she's not reading it as a history book?
No. For her, the story of Pharaoh, Moses, the Israelite slaves, the vast, terrifying wilderness, it's all a living, breathing metaphor for the inward path of the human soul. Every single character represents a different state of mind.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, or a different stage of spiritual evolution, or a different psychological pressure that we face.
And what makes her so uniquely qualified to talk about this? Because, this isn't just a dry academic commentary, right? This is someone who lived this intense inward journey.
Absolutely. Jeanne Guyon was essentially a radical in her time. In late 17th century France, under the reign of King Louis XIV, the religious establishment was incredibly rigid.
Right, very structured.
Highly structured, and entirely focused on outward performance, rituals, obedience to the hierarchy. And here comes this woman claiming that the truest path to the divine isn't through endless external works or, climbing the religious ladder.
It's inward.
Right, it's through a radical, silent, inward surrender to God. She essentially told people that they didn't need the massive, exhausting machinery of the state church to find the divine. They just needed to yield entirely in their own hearts.
Which I imagine the establishment absolutely loved.
Oh, they hated it.
Yeah, I bet.
It was completely disruptive to their power structure. So she was accused of heresy, she was interrogated, and she was actually imprisoned in the Bastille for years.
Wait, really? The Bastille?
Yes, because her teachings on inward quiet and mystical rest were deemed so dangerous to the status quo.
That is wild.
So when she writes about the violent opposition to the inward path, she isn't speaking theoretically. She is writing from the crucible of actual persecution.
Okay, and that leads us directly to the central tension we're going to explore today.
Yeah.
This is the hook that grabbed me instantly when reading through these sources. The pursuit of quiet, inward reflection is almost always violently opposed.
Always.
It's opposed by the hustle culture of the secular world. But shockingly, the text argues it's also violently opposed by inexperienced spiritual leaders.
Yeah, the inside of the house.
Right. Leaders who disguise their own lack of profound understanding as a demand for you to produce more, metaphorical bricks.
Exactly. The conflict between doing and being, between external performance and internal surrender. It's a timeless human struggle, and Guyon dissects the anatomy of this opposition with surgical precision. And she starts with the ultimate archetype of the worldly mind.
Right, Pharaoh. So if we look at the narrative, Moses goes to Pharaoh. He stands before the most powerful man on the planet and says, "Let my people go so they can hold a festival to God in the wilderness."
Right.
And Pharaoh gives this infamous, incredibly arrogant response. He looks at Moses and says, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go.
Now, in a traditional Sunday school reading, that is just the antagonist establishing his villainy. He's the bad guy in the story. But Guyon interprets this response, that specific phrase, I do not know the Lord, not just as historical defiance, but as the absolute defining characteristic of the proud mind. To her, Pharaoh represents what she calls the libertines.
Okay, wait. When we hear the word libertine today, we usually think of someone who is, like, morally unrestrained, like a hedonist partying in the 1920s. Is that what she means?
Not exactly. In her 17th century context, a libertine was essentially a free thinker.
Ah, okay.
It was someone who rejected religious or mystical authority in favor of pure rationalism and worldly pragmatism. They were the highly educated, secular, purely rational minds of the day.
So the intellectuals.
Exactly. And Guyon also equates Pharaoh's mindset with what she calls the great men of the age, the titans of industry, the political power brokers, the people whose entire reality is built on tangible, visible power.
And the text makes a very bold claim about these types of people. It states that the proud do not know God, and that only the humble, those who serve with a simple heart, can actually comprehend the divine. It frames Pharaoh's question, who is the Lord, as a manifestation of an arrogance that deserves 1,000 hells. So according to the source, why is this specific type of rational, highly successful, worldly mindset so entirely blinding?
Well, think about the epistemology of a king or a CEO or a modern tech billionaire.
Yeah.
Their entire worldview, the way they process reality and truth, is entirely predicated on control, empirical proof, and measurable outcomes.
Okay, yeah.
Pharaoh is a king who builds literal pyramids. He demands signs. He demands miracles. He respects what he can measure, what he can tax, and what he can conquer.
So when Moses shows up.
When Moses comes talking about an invisible God who doesn't want monuments or gold, but instead demands an inward devotion, a sacrifice of the heart out in the empty wilderness, it computes as literal nonsense to Pharaoh.
It doesn't fit on the spreadsheet.
Exactly. The text argues that this specific type of arrogance, the assumption that if I can't measure it, it isn't real, completely shuts down the capacity for spiritual perception. The proud mind requires everything to be brought down to its level of understanding.
But wait, I want to push back on this a little bit because it feels a little too easy to just bash successful people.
Sure.
Isn't this just a convenient excuse for people who fail in the real world? Like, it sounds a bit like sour grapes, you know? I can't build a successful business, I can't climb the corporate ladder, so I'll just sit in a quiet room and claim I'm spiritually superior to the people who are actually getting things done. Is she just hating on success?
That's a very fair modern critique, honestly. But Guyon is not criticizing competence or success in itself. She's diagnosing the attachment to control.
The attachment.
Yes. The text emphasizes that the inward path requires a complete surrender of control. You cannot optimize an inward state of mystical rest.
You can't life hack it.
Right. You can't force an encounter with the divine by pulling the right levers or managing your time better. The worldly mind, the great man of the age, is terrified of surrender. Because if value isn't found in what you conquer, organize, or produce, then the great man is suddenly stripped of his greatness.
It's an identity crisis.
A massive one. To the proud mind, any warning about the state of their soul or any invitation to stop doing and just be is met with absolute derision.
Wow.
They don't just misunderstand it, they actively despise it because it threatens the very metric by which they justify their existence. When the text says they're unwilling to heed the warnings delivered by God's servants, it's because those warnings operate on a frequency they have completely tuned out. They demand empirical proof.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So if Pharaoh represents the ultimate opposition from the outside world, like the secular, metric-driven rejection of the inward life, you'd think the safe haven would be inside the spiritual community.
You would think so.
You'd think the church, the monastery, the meditation retreat, that these places would be the sanctuary from the spreadsheet. But Guyon says the exact opposite happens, and this is honestly terrifying. If Pharaoh represents the opposition from the outside, it's fascinating how this exact same oppressive mindset infiltrates the inside of spiritual communities.
This is where Guyon's commentary becomes piercingly critical. And you can see exactly why she ended up in a royal prison.
Furiously.
She takes aim directly at the religious leaders of her day. And her critique is incredibly resonant for anyone navigating spiritual or self-help communities today.
So let's look at what happens next in the story. Moses has asked for the people to go worship. Pharaoh's response is brutal retaliation. He tells the slave drivers, "You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw." but require them to make the same number of bricks as before, don't reduce the quota.
Right.
And what is his reasoning for this cruelty? He repeatedly calls the Israelites lazy. He says, they are lazy, that is why they are crying out, let us go and sacrifice to our God. Make the work harder for the people so that they keep working and pay no attention to lies.
And Guyon takes this historical narrative of physical economic slavery and applies it directly to the psychology of the spiritual life.
How so?
The text explains that those who are walking the inward path, those who are drawn to silent prayer, deep contemplation, and a simple consecration of their heart to God, are constantly accused of laziness.
Wow.
And they aren't just accused of laziness by the secular world, they're accused of it by their own spiritual directors.
The text explicitly calls out inexperienced spiritual directors. It says these are leaders who absolutely do not understand what Guyon terms mystical rest in God. Let's really drill down into this because this feels so applicable to modern life. What is going on in the mind of a spiritual leader when they see someone who just wants to sit in silence?
Well, think about the business model, so to speak, of an inexperienced spiritual guide. Their entire authority, their sense of purpose, and often their livelihood is based on organizing activities, teaching complex methods, tracking attendance, and measuring the outward devotion of their followers.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah. If a follower comes along and says, I don't need the 10-step program. I don't need the endless reading lists. I'm just going to sit here in quiet contemplation and commune with the divine. That leader panics.
They panic because it makes them obsolete.
Exactly. The follower who rests in God is a threat to the leader who manages behaviors. Guyon exposes this psychological fragility brilliantly. She says these inexperienced leaders actually conspire together. They look at the contemplative person and say, let's load this person with external works. Let's make them tired.
They literally try to exhaust them out of their contemplation.
Yes.
They claim that this quiet devotion is just idle fantasy, or, as Pharaoh said, lies and false words. Think about your own life, especially in the workplace or even in your personal growth journey. Have you ever had a manager who sees you quietly thinking through a complex problem, assumes you're just staring at a wall, slacking off, and immediately hands you a stack of pointless busywork just to see you physically moving?
We've all been there.
The text is saying spiritual leaders do this exact same thing. They trap people in methods.
It is the tragedy of the unilluminated guide. Guyon argues that these leaders mistake the stillness of deep waters for a stagnant puddle. They think if you aren't sweating, you aren't growing.
Right.
So they prescribe mandatory readings, endless lists of spiritual chores, rigorous fasting regimens, complex vocal prayers. The text points out that these external practices eventually become completely unbearable.
And what is the cost of that to the individual? If I'm a sincere person and my trusted guide tells me I need to make all these spiritual bricks, I'm going to try to do it, right?
Of course you are. You trust them. And that is where the damage occurs. The text says that by forcing these individuals into rigid methods, the leaders actually strip the believers of the power to bear fruit.
They drain them.
Completely. They lose the very energy that was meant for their deep inward spiritual growth because it's being entirely siphoned off by the heavy yoke of external expectations. You are so busy gathering your own straw and trying to hit your quota of morning meditations, journal entries, and volunteer hours that your soul is utterly depleted.
And if you fail, like if you finally collapse and say, I can't make the quota anymore, I don't have the straw.
The text notes that historically, just like the Israelite foremen who were beaten by Pharaoh's slave drivers, these individuals are punished, metaphorically beaten.
Yeah.
They're ridiculed, shamed by their community, told they're backsliding, or diagnosed as spiritually apathetic. Guyon frames this opposition and mockery as an almost inevitable friction. The more a person is destined to share in the divine life, the more they will face the specific kind of misunderstanding from human institutions.
It paints a very bleak picture of religious and self-help communities. But there is a twist here in the source material, a paradox about divine protection that happens right in the middle of this oppression.
Yes, and this is one of the most stunning insights from Guyon's commentary. We have all this human failure, the secular pharaohs demanding economic output, and the inexperienced spiritual directors piling on unbearable religious burdens. It seems like a recipe for the total destruction of the soul.
Yeah, it sounds hopeless.
But the text argues that God is secretly using this exact pressure, this exact exhaustion, to hide his chosen ones.
Okay, how does exhaustion hide someone? That feels counterintuitive. Usually exhaustion exposes you. You break down. You fall apart.
It does break you down, but it breaks down the external architecture. The text says God uses this external exhaustion to draw the believer into a secret place in his presence, entirely away from human disturbance.
A secret place.
Think about the mechanics of this. By making the external world, both the secular and the religious world, so punishing, so thoroughly exhausting, and completely devoid of spiritual nourishment, the believer is essentially forced to retreat entirely inward.
Ah, because they literally have nowhere else to go.
Exactly. The oppression builds the walls of the sanctuary. The world rejects them. The religious leaders shame them for being lazy. Their own efforts to keep up the methods completely fail. The external landscape becomes a hostile desert. And so, out of sheer survival, the soul retracts into the deepest, quietest center of its own being, where God is waiting. God essentially allows the world to make itself so utterly unappealing and unbearable that the soul willingly embraces the quiet isolation it previously feared.
Wow, so the very thing designed to destroy their spiritual life is the exact mechanism that finalizes their isolation with the divine. The busy work cures them of their desire for busy work.
Exactly.
That is incredibly profound. But we also have to acknowledge the messy, painful human reality of this process. You can't just pile bricks and beatings on someone endlessly without a consequence. When the burden becomes truly unbearable and all these spiritual methods completely fail, a psychological breaking point is inevitable. You don't just peacefully float into inward contemplation, you usually crash into it.
And that brings us to the most agonizing part of the journey. This is where the path gets exceedingly dark before any light appears.
So let's look at the narrative again. The situation for the Israelites has hit rock bottom. The foremen of the Israelites confront Moses and Aaron, and they are furious. Like, they are not feeling very spiritual right now.
No, not at all.
They say, "May the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us a stench to Pharaoh and his officials and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." And then Moses, the great spiritual guide, turns to God and he completely unloads. He complains. He says, "Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Why did you ever send me? Since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all."
It is a moment of total systems failure. The promise was freedom. The promise was a land flowing with milk and honey. But the immediate reality is drastically increased suffering.
I have to ask a provocative question here, because reading this, I am entirely on the side of the Israelites. Honestly, can we blame them? Moses did make things worse. From their perspective, this spiritual guide showed up, promised them the world, and literally walked them right into a dead end. They were surviving before, they were slaves, yes, but they had a routine. Now they're being beaten and starved of materials. Why does Guyon's text frame their reaction as a failure or as infidelity? It seems like a completely rational, mathematically correct human response to a failed promise.
It is a completely rational human response, and that is precisely the problem. Guyon is diagnosing the classic struggle of the beginner in the spiritual life.
The beginner. So she views the Israelites here as spiritual novices.
Yes. The text states that people eagerly and joyfully follow God's path when it is filled with what it calls sweetness and miracles.
Okay.
When spirituality feels good, when it brings peace, prosperity, warm, fuzzy feelings, and visible signs of success, everyone is on board. The Israelites saw the staff turn into a snake, they heard the promises, and they worshipped. But, Guyon points out, beginners immediately rebel when the path brings only crosses.
The crosses. That's a loaded term. Let's define what she means by that in this psychological context.
In mystical literature, the cross represents the specific intersection where our human will, our ego, and our desires are thwarted.
Oh, okay.
It's the frustration of our agenda. Guyon explains that beginners in the spiritual life lack the endurance to trust God when the sensory experience of God is removed and replaced with suffering or silence. They judge the validity of their spiritual path by how comfortable it is or by how much external success it's generating.
So they're essentially transactional.
Completely transactional. I follow you, you make my life easier. When the comfort vanishes, their faith vanishes, hence her use of the term infidelity. They were faithful to the feeling of the blessing, they were faithful to the miracles, but they were not actually faithful to the source of it. They loved the gifts, not the giver.
Ouch. That is a brutal mirror to hold up to anyone's spiritual or personal growth journey. How often do we quit a new practice just because the initial dopamine hit wears off and it gets hard?
All the time.
But wait, I have another issue here. The Israelites complain to Moses, and they're labeled as unfaithful beginners. But then Moses turns around and complains to God, and his complaint is aggressive. You have not rescued your people at all. How is Moses' complaint different from the Israelites' complaint? Why isn't Moses accused of infidelity here by the author?
This is a brilliant nuance in the text, and it raises a crucial point about the nature of leadership, mediation, and maturity. Guyon draws a very sharp contrast here. The Israelites are complaining out of self-preservation, wounded ego, and despair. They're saying, make our pain stop.
Right.
But Moses' complaint to God is described by the text as the prayer of a true shepherd speaking from a heart of love.
How so? He's still complaining.
Look at the focus of the complaint. Moses isn't complaining that he is suffering, or that his reputation is ruined, or that he's uncomfortable. He's advocating entirely for his suffering people. He's expressing the deep, agonizing perplexity of a leader who implicitly trusted God's promise, but only sees destruction happening to those he loves. It is an act of intercession, not rebellion. He is bewildered by the mechanism of God's deliverance, but he's still turning to God to wrestle with it, rather than turning away.
Okay, that makes sense. He's standing in the gap. He's saying, I believed you, but look at what's happening to them. Explain this to me.
Exactly.
And this leads to an absolutely massive point in the source material about the timeline of the divine. Because Moses wants immediate deliverance, but God operates on a very different schedule. Guyon makes this profound observation. She says, God's promises take much longer to fulfill than we expect. You will find the events in between are much more numerous than we imagine.
If we really pause and think about that, it's one of the most sobering truths of any long-term endeavor, let alone the deepest transformation of the human soul. We want the promise, and we want it by Friday. But God operates on a geological timeline. The text highlights a stark, terrifying historical fact to illustrate just how long and grueling this process is. Of all the hundreds of thousands of people who were originally saved from Egypt, who walked through the Red Sea, who ate manna from heaven and saw the miracles,
Yeah.
only 2 of that original adult generation actually entered the Promised Land.
Just 2, Joshua and Caleb.
Right.
Everyone else died in the wilderness over the course of 40 years. The text uses that attrition rate to say, who can fathom God's deep judgments? It implies that many are called to the path of inward suffering. Many start the journey out of Egypt, but very, very few endure the process of being entirely stripped of their worldly expectations.
Which brings us to perhaps the most complex, difficult, and fascinating concept in the entire source material. It's a concept hidden in a footnote regarding those deep judgments of God.
Okay, let's hear it.
The text says that God's true judgments and purposes are entirely hidden from creatures until the moment the believer is born from the Creator's bosom.
Born from the Creator's bosom. Okay, we need to spend some serious time here because this is heavy, dense, mystical theology. What does this actually mean in practice?
The footnote explains that this phrase refers to the ultimate culmination of what mystics call mystical death. Guyon argues that before you can be born anew from the Creator's bosom, you must undergo a complete, agonizing process of mystical death, burial, and decay.
Decay. Okay, you have to help me with this. Decay is a very strong, very negative word. When we talk about personal or spiritual growth, we use metaphors of life. We talk about a seed sprouting, a plant blooming, a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. We don't usually talk about spiritual rotting.
No, we don't.
What on earth does she mean by decay, and what does that actually look like for me on a random Tuesday? Am I losing my ambition? Do I stop caring about my family? How does this not just turn into severe clinical depression or sheer apathy?
It is the most vital distinction to make. What is decaying is not your humanity, your personality, or your capacity to love. What is decaying is the ego.
The ego.
It is the self-will, the part of you that needs to measure the daily quota of bricks, the part that desperately needs to be seen as a great person of the age, the part that demands sweetness and miracles and violently rejects crosses. Guyon says all of that must die and rot away.
But practically, how does that feel?
Practically, it feels like an utter loss of your spiritual footing. For a time, your prayers might feel empty. The methods and routines that used to bring you joy now feel like ash in your mouth. You might feel entirely abandoned by God.
That sounds terrifying.
It is. You lose the desire to defend your reputation. If someone calls you lazy, you don't fight back with a list of your accomplishments. You let the accusation sit there. You let your ego take the hit, and you don't retaliate. That is the decay, the rotting away of your defense mechanisms.
That sounds excruciating.
It is, which is why only 2 out of a whole generation made it. Most people hit that wilderness of silence and immediately try to build a golden calf to get the good feelings back.
Oh, wow, yeah.
But the text says that when a person finally endures this decay, when they emerge from this state, when they leave the tomb, so to speak, they find themselves in an entirely new reality.
And what does that reality look like? How does a person function in the world, like doing their job, raising their kids, if their ego has completely decayed?
The text describes it beautifully. It says, this person spontaneously lives out Christ's nature. Notice the word spontaneously.
Spontaneous.
They don't even have to try anymore. They don't have to pause in a moment of crisis and intellectually recall, what is the heart and disposition of Christ in this moment? What did chapter 4 of that self-help book say I should do?
They aren't constantly auditing themselves.
Exactly. They don't have to consult a manual, a spreadsheet, or a spiritual method. The divine disposition is naturally deeply rooted in them. They're completely dead to self. And because they're dead to self, they view absolutely everything purely through God's judgment, not their own biased, fearful lens.
So it's the end of efforting. It's the end of the hustle, not just physically in terms of making bricks, but spiritually.
Yeah.
You aren't constantly striving to be a good person because the very mechanism of striving, the ego that wants a reward for being good, is gone. It's just spontaneous, natural, right action.
Exactly. It's the ultimate state of flow, but on a divine level. You're reacting to your environment exactly as the divine would naturally, without friction.
I just marvel at this concept. If this agonizing process, the demands for bricks without straw, the oppression from the world, the misunderstanding and shaming from religious leaders, the agonizing wait in the quiet wilderness, if all of this stripping away of our external works and expectations is simply meant to kill our ego, what is left? When we are reduced to absolute zero, what exactly do we discover in that empty space?
And that brings us to the ultimate revelation of the text, the philosophical climax of Guyon's commentary.
Let's get into it. This is where the narrative shifts from the destruction of the old to the revelation of the new. Let's look at how God responds to Moses' agonized complaint. We're in Exodus chapter 6 now. God promises to act with a stretched out arm, but then God reveals something extraordinary, something deeply mysterious.
Yeah.
He says to Moses, I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name Jehovah or Adonai, I did not make myself known to them.
This is a massive theological statement, and Guyon's interpretation of it is brilliant. She maps the three great patriarchs of the faith, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to three distinct, progressive stages of the spiritual journey.
Let's break those down because this mapping is fascinating.
According to Guyon's text, Abraham represents naked faith.
Yeah.
He is the one who believed God against all logical odds, left his homeland, and trusted a promise he couldn't see.
Okay, that makes sense.
Isaac represents pure consecration. He was the willing sacrifice, yielding himself on the altar. And Jacob, who is renamed Israel, represents complete abandonment. This is perfectly illustrated by his famous wrestling match with the angel in the dark, where he wrestled until his hip was put out of joint. He was forced to abandon his own physical strength and rely entirely on a blessing.
Okay, I have to stop you there, because this raises a huge red flag for me. Abraham is the ultimate father of faith for three major world religions. Isaac is the paragon of sacrifice. Jacob literally wrestled with the divine and became the namesake of an entire nation. These are the absolute heavyweights of history.
They are.
Yet, Madame Guyon is saying that even they didn't know God's greatest name. Why does Moses get this ultimate VIP revelation of the name Adonai? What makes Moses so different, so much more advanced than the patriarchs?
It all comes down to Guyon's definition of the name Adonai. She defines Adonai as supreme sovereignty, the I am that I am, or I am self-existent. Moses receives this unparalleled revelation because of his unique, unprecedented role. The text says God chose Moses to be the legislator, not just for the common Israelites, but specifically to be the archetype and guide for the people of the inward life. Moses is the ultimate guide for those who are destined to walk the path all the way to mystical death.
So, to lead people to that ultimate state of ego death, Moses had to possess a deeper revelation than even the patriarchs who just modeled faith or consecration.
Yes. And to teach this ultimate level of the inward path, Moses had to deeply, experientially understand one core, terrifying, and infinitely liberating truth. The text states it plainly as the ultimate realization of the soul. I am everything, the creature is nothing.
I am everything, the creature is nothing. But let's sit with that for a minute. That is the philosophical peak of this episode. But I have to be honest, to a modern ear, being told that you, the creature, are nothing sounds incredibly insulting.
It does.
It sounds like psychological abuse. It sounds like nihilism, like you are nothing, you don't matter. How do we reconcile this? How is this not just a recipe for self-loathing?
It's a very understandable reaction, but it is vital to view this through the mystical lens, not a modern self-esteem-focused psychological one.
Mm-hmm.
In this context, nothingness is not about worthlessness. It is not saying you are garbage.
Okay.
It's about recognizing fundamental reality. It is an ontological statement. God is the only self-existent reality, the I am. God relies on nothing else to exist. Everything else, you, me, the stars, the universe, is contingent. We only exist because God sustains us moment by moment.
We're derived.
Exactly. When a person realizes their own true nothingness, they aren't hating themselves. They're simply dropping the exhausting illusion that they are a separate, independent, self-sustaining God of their own little universe. They drop the heavy burden of control.
It's the ultimate surrender. It's admitting I don't actually keep the planet spinning and I don't actually have to control every outcome in my life.
Yes. The text speaks of this state as a profound, mutual surrender. It says that those who accept their own nothingness completely honor God's supreme sovereignty. Because these individuals, and I'll quote the concept here, without exception and without reservation, completely abandon themselves to God, something incredible happens in return.
The transaction flips. What happens?
The text says that because the soul has emptied itself of its ego, God gives himself to them more than to others. God, in his infinite, untouchable power, allows himself to be conquered by the gift of love.
Conquered by love? Wow.
He gives himself in a transcendent, intimate way to those who are completely governed by him. It's an exchange. You give God your nothingness, your empty, decayed vessel, and God fills it entirely with his everything. You become a pure conduit for the divine, unblocked by your own desperate need to be important.
So, bringing this lofty 17th century mystical theology back down to earth for you, the listener, right now, we connect this all the way back to the hustle culture we talked about at the beginning. The pharaohs of your life demanding bricks without straw. The spiritual directors demanding endless, optimized morning routines. The realization of your own nothingness isn't an insult at all. It is actually the ultimate liberation.
It really is.
Think about it. If you are nothing, you don't have a quota of bricks to meet to justify your existence.
Exactly.
You don't have to defend your fragile ego when the inexperienced spiritual director calls you lazy for just sitting in silence. You don't have to prove your worth on a spreadsheet.
You cannot exhaust, manipulate, or threaten a person who has accepted their own nothingness. What are you going to take from them? They've already willingly given everything away.
Right.
What reputation can you ruin? They are dead to self. They don't care what you think of them. The pharaohs of the world, the bosses, the algorithms, the critics, have absolutely no leverage over a person who rests in the reality of Adonai.
Wow. That brings everything beautifully full circle. Let's trace the arc of this incredible journey we've just taken. We started with the sheer arrogance of worldly productivity, the mind of Pharaoh that demands empirical proof, metrics, and ROI, and entirely rejects the quiet inner voice.
Yeah.
We move through the agonizing trap of religious busywork, where inexperienced leaders try to drown our spiritual rest in endless tasks and methods, accidentally forcing us into the quiet sanctuary of our own isolation. We navigated the psychological breaking point, the crisis of the cross in the wilderness, and the painful, necessary stripping away of our transactional expectations, all the way to the liberating ultimate revelation, accepting our own nothingness, letting the ego decay to make room for the divine everything.
It's a remarkable progression. It is the roadmap from the slavery of external validation to profound existential freedom.
And to you listening to this deep dive, we want to remind you of the core value of what Madame Guyon unpacked hundreds of years ago from a prison cell. You live in a world that constantly, aggressively demands that you prove your worth. It asks you every single day how many bricks you can produce, and it rarely gives you the straw you need to do it without burning out.
So true.
But there's profound ancient wisdom in choosing to step off that assembly line. There is immense power in choosing the path of inward rest, even if the secular world or even your own spiritual community calls you lazy, unproductive, or unfaithful.
I think the most challenging yet ultimately liberating aspect of this text is how it forces us to confront our deepest, most hidden motivations. Why are we really trying so hard to grow? Which brings up a final thought. It's something that isn't explicitly detailed in the text itself, but it is the undeniable, logical conclusion of everything Madame Guyon has argued today.
Let's hear it. Lay it on us.
We spend our entire modern lives chasing this concept of self-actualization. We're obsessed with finding ourselves, expressing our unique truth, and building our personal brands. But if Madame Guyon is right, if the ultimate peak of the inward path is the revelation of Adonai, the realization that the creature is nothing and God is everything, does that mean true? Ultimate freedom is actually found in the complete and total abandonment of the need to be somebody at all.
Oh, that is heavy. Is the desperate pursuit of somebodyness the actual trap keeping us enslaved in Egypt? That is exactly the kind of question we want you to take with you today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this conversation has challenged you, maybe comforted you if you're feeling exhausted by the hustle, and given you permission to lay down a few of those heavy bricks you've been carrying around. Mull over that final thought, find some quiet time for genuine inward.
For more spiritual resources, visit lokaken.ai.